So I'd like to say welcome and welcome back to many of you who've been here on previous occasions and follow more or less the same format as previously, if I can remember correctly. I'm going to begin with a discourse for maybe 45 minutes or so, and then we can maybe have a short break, and then a period of sitting meditation, and then I'll answer any questions, or if there's anything you'd like to discuss or put me right about if I make any mistakes. So the teachings of the Buddha are referred to in the Pali language by a number of well-known terms. One of them is ehipassiko, and ehipassiko is rather difficult to translate, and what you'd usually find in English books is the come and see Dhamma, or something of that nature. So the idea being that this is a teaching that invites you to come and take a look, put it to the test, and it's certainly not a teaching comprised of dogmas which you are required to believe in. But there are a number of propositions about nature of human life, the nature of the good life, given the fact that our time here as human beings is limited, and as we don't know the extent of that limitation, then a question arises: what's the best way for us to spend the time that we do have? And so the Buddha has many suggestions with regards to that kind of question. Given an initial interest in spiritual development, where the Buddha does tend to be quite authoritative, is in his explanation of various stages of spiritual life, in the practice of meditation, very precise psychological definitions of particular experiences that meditator will go through, what enlightenment means, not in a sort of hazy kind of New Age way, but very particularly in terms of the psychological, irrevocable psychological changes that take place when one reaches a certain level of development, almost what we might call quantum leaps of consciousness. So within this path that the Buddha taught, which I often refer to as an education system rather than a belief system, the Buddha goes into great detail as regards both those practices, both those attitudes, values, perceptions, thoughts that support and those which hinder the progress of the aspirant. And I think today I'm going to talk about a group of those. If any of you have read any of the Buddhist scriptures and the discourses you may well have noticed this particular style of teaching in which there are groups of 2, groups of 3s, groups of 4s, groups of 5s, and apart from its obvious role in facilitating memory, these groups are not randomly chosen, but in many cases there are very interesting and subtle links between the different members of a group, and they are often what we may call kind of a holistic system of either of virtues or even of vices. Now, one of these groups of 3 consists of 3 negative qualities. One is called Tanha, or in Thai Tanha. One is called Mana, and one is called Ditthi. So Tanha is craving, and Mana is conceit, and Ditthi is views. So these are 3 mental qualities which retard the spiritual process, spiritual life. So we call them retarding agents, retardation, something like that. The first one is the one that you probably have heard of, the Lord craving, or Tanha. Now, before going into too much detail on this, I think it's worth emphasizing this very important point that Buddhism distinguishes between different kinds of desire, using this basic standard of whether something is wholesome or unwholesome. The word wholesome or unwholesome is translation, again, excuse me if there's too much of these technical terms, but it is worth learning a few of these. There's kusala and akusala. Now, wholesome or kusala dhammas means those qualities which lead to freedom, or at least a lessening of the power of negativity, based around 3 kind of poles of negativity, which we summarize as greed, hatred, and delusion. Okay. Unwholesome or akusala dhammas are those qualities which partake of and enhance, strengthen the power of those negative factors of greed, hatred, and delusion. Greed, hatred, and delusion are titles of are clusters of mental states. So hatred, for instance, refers to the whole spectrum of negative energy. It includes even the slightest kinds of irritation, and goes right up to the most extreme kind of rage and hatred. So this one word, hatred, here must be understood to be a blanket or an umbrella term for many different negative mental states. Similarly, greed covers a whole spectrum of mental states, from the most subtle kind of movement towards something with a desire to grasp it, or to become one with it, or to possess it, right to the most extreme forms of grasping or sexual desire or whatever. Delusion, similarly, covers all kinds of mental states which are characterized or exemplified by fuzziness, confusion, and includes things like fear, anxiety, depression, and so on and so forth. So I'll recap there, and so that I'm not losing you. 2 kinds of desire, and one kind of desire is unwholesome. That is to say, it is bound up irrevocably with and leads to an increase of the power of greed, hatred, and delusion. The unwholesome kind of desire, sorry, that was the unwholesome, wasn't it? The wholesome, I'm getting mixed up myself now. So the wholesome is the one which leads to the decrease, gradual elimination, freedom from these negative qualities. Now the unwholesome kind of desire is what we call Tanha. And the wholesome kind of desire has another name which is not so well known, and that is Chanta or Kusala Chanta or Dhamma Chanta, which means the will towards Dhamma, the will towards truth, the will towards goodness. So when it's the Buddhist teachings are commonly summarized as life is suffering because of desire, that is so much of a condensation of the teaching that it's positively, if that's the right word, it's definitely misleading, because the word suffering here is a very profound term, which maybe I'll go into later on. But the word I want to focus on here is desire, and it has to be made clear that it is the tanha or unwholesome form of desire here that is referred to, and not the wholesome kind of desire. If there's no wholesome kind of desire, then there's no spiritual life, and there's no effort. Then you can just sort of vegetate and just put up with whatever happens as best you can. But the Buddhist teaching is very far from being a teaching of passivity. In fact, of the words, epithets which the Buddha chose to define what he was teaching, he said this is a teaching of effort. So it's a teaching of all the different religious teachings in India at that time. It was one which was distinguished by its emphasis on effort and the fact that human effort is possible and is efficacious. So this was in direct contrast or conflict with teachings that taught that everything's preordained, or that happiness and suffering is determined by a heavenly power, for instance. So the kind of desire which is the cause of suffering is the unwholesome kind of desire called Tanha. The other kind of desire is not to be abandoned, quite the contrary, it's to be adopted and made much of. Indeed, in the efforts to let go of, to abandon this unwholesome kind of desire, one skillful means to be adopted is to boost and to encourage the wholesome desire. So it's like channeling this energy from the unwholesome channel into the wholesome channel. Now, craving is inseparable from ignorance. So this is again one of the basic, most important propositions that the Buddha made. He said that we don't really understand ourselves or the world that we live in. And of the various forms of misunderstanding which we're subject to, the most important one is the assumption as a kind of basic premise of our existence, of this independent, self-existent entity called me or I. Now, with that fundamental mistake of consciousness, of perception, of thought, then what immediately springs up is craving. Okay? So craving is the desire which is inseparable from the lack of understanding or misunderstanding of who we are, what life's all about. So that's the bad news, and the good news is that it's something that we can eradicate, because if we develop a clear, direct understanding of the way things are, then the foundation for that kind of desire is removed. So craving is divided. Usually, there are different ways of doing this, but three kinds of craving. One is sensual craving, another is the craving to become, and the third is the craving to get rid of. So the craving, the sensual craving, is the desire for forms, sounds, odors, tastes, touch, body sensations, and mental activity. So we want something to be happening all the time, and this is based upon an idea that we grow, that we benefit, that we make a gain through pleasant sensual experiences, and that somehow we are made poorer by a lack of the pleasant sensual experiences, or having to put up with experience unpleasant sensual experiences. Here I think you may be able to see that relationship with ignorance that I spoke of just now is that, why do you want that? Why is that movement, that impulsive, instinctive movement towards the sensory world, other than through the unspoken assumption that there is someone here who will benefit from it? So that is there actually this being here who is enriched by sensual experience? This is one of the things that we seek to explore in meditation. So we want to have something going on and as pleasant as possible. Now, when we crave something, what tends to happen is that we value it. We give value to the things we crave, to the extent that people can say, if I don't get that, I don't want to live. Or someone who has some heartbreak or something decides to kill themselves because they've given so much value to that relationship or to the feelings that they derive from that relationship, that they feel that is the essence of who I am, my life, and without it, it's not worth being alive. So this is the process by which we value the things that we crave, and that giving a unrealistic value to the things we crave is the essence of what in Buddhism is called attachment. Okay, so we want, we desire, we feel we need, but the problem is that sensory experience is limited. And we as this body and mind, as the experiences of sensory pleasure, are also limited. As to say that no matter how pleasant an experience might be, if you have it enough, you're going to get bored with it. And before you get bored, you get used to it. And so the initial buzz of experience cannot be sustained indefinitely. You cannot go on enjoying something for very long. And that's built into the nature of existence. Our nervous systems, our physical bodies can't sustain that kind of intense experience for very long at one time. That which is providing the enjoyment is also unsustainable. And a very common experience, as I'm sure you know, is that of diminishing returns. That in the coarse example of drug addiction, for instance, you find you have to keep increasing the dose of the drug to get the same level of enjoyment. So these are some of the drawbacks or the weaknesses of the search for happiness in the sensual world. Again, I'd like to emphasize that the Buddha wasn't taking like sort of a Puritan stance against sensual pleasure, but he was concerned that we should look at it very closely and ask ourselves, does it really give us what we want it to? Because we may find that behind that desire for sensory pleasure, there's actually a desire for a happiness which is unchanging. And if we are indeed seeking a happiness which is unchanging through the pursuit of things that change all the time, then we're going to finally end up with nothing more than frustration. So in the last few years, many of you may know the subject of happiness has become very fashionable as a subject of scientific studies. There are a number of very good books out there on this subject. I can recommend one that was sent to me recently and won a prize in England called Stumbling on Happiness. I don't know if anyone's read this book. There's a lot of very interesting experiments in there. But one of the recurring results of these studies has found that an increase in wealth has a corresponding increase in happiness only with people who are in a state of fundamental insecurity, meaning that they don't have the basics to sustain themselves physically. They don't have enough food to eat or for their family. They don't have a roof over their head. They don't have clothing. They don't have adequate clothing. They don't have access to medical care when they're sick. So in that case, certainly, you give somebody $10 or $100, it's going to make an appreciable difference to their level of happiness. But what's interesting is once you go beyond that level and someone has no rational need to worry about subsistence, then an increase in wealth has less and less effect on one's happiness level, to the extent that if we're talking larger sums of money, say the difference between I don't know, $500,000, $1 million, 10 million, 100 million, 1,000 million, or Bill Gates. It's hardly significant. It really makes no difference. And this is not some kind of spiritual teaching as a